Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second meeting of the work group on assessment of funding facilities assessment. We're going to focus on statewide data related to facilities conditions index today. Talk a little bit, or at least have our presenters tell us how they gathered this data, how the way they do assessments may be different from how our local schools and school boards do assessments. There are two components that are combined to complete this study. One is the physical condition of the school measured by the Facilities Condition Index, or FCI, and two is the educational sufficiency standards. Please note, although they will describe the differences between the two, we are not going to be looking at sufficiency standards until our next meeting. So this meeting is really about the physical condition of our schools measured by the Facility Condition Index. We will take questions throughout the presentation, by the way, because the presentation is lengthy, and if you have any question at any point during the presentation, please raise your yellow hand and I will recognize it and you can ask the question. If there aren't any questions before we begin, I'm going to turn to the IEC to begin the presentation on the FCI data. Any questions?
Thank you, Chair. Alex?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the work group. It's my privilege today to resume our conversation about the statewide facilities assessment. With us from our contractor, Bureau Veritas North America, are Bill Champion, Project Manager, supported also by Tom Bart, IT Manager, and Matt Munter, Principal and Executive Vice President. Bill, with our next slide.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by providing an update on the process of the assessment. We've completed 1,404 assessments of active and holding school facilities at the end of June, and have only the buildings on 2 campuses of the Maryland School for the Deaf remaining to assess. Depending on the size of the facility, we sent between 1 and 3 licensed engineers or architects to evaluate the condition of each major building system, and between 1 and 2 assessors to measure and evaluate the spaces against the sufficiency standards. Prior to assignment, all assessors received at least 40 hours of training on a set of common guidelines fleshed out by visual examples of various ranges of condition. We're currently completing the quality control process with the LEAs this week and next, after which we'll be ready to export and share with the LEAs the preliminary FCI data by school. We expect to share that data in the first or second week of August. As we reviewed last time, the assessment has a number of purposes, but foremost amongst them are to provide a uniform measure of the physical condition and educational sufficiency of each facility, and to transparently provide a clear differentiation between the needs from highest to lowest. And we also pointed out last time how Maryland's statewide assessment differs from typical facility condition assessment, but it does bear repeating. Most assessments focus on estimating the cost of maintenance that's been deferred, or the cost to repair those building components that are identified as being likely to fail in the near term. This omits from the picture those items that have more than a couple years worth of functionality left in them. So that leaves a substantial part of the condition picture obscured. In addition, most assessments don't measure the facilities against standards for educational sufficiency. As a result, facilities that don't support education well, but are in good physical condition, score inappropriately highly. Maryland's assessment goes deeper by evaluating both the condition and the educational sufficiency of the facility, both now as projected and into the future, in a way that supports longer-term planning and budgeting, as well as more comprehensive and effective portfolio management. It allows for true comparability of systems and facilities across each LEA and the state. It will differentiate between greater and lesser needs to help direct available funds to where they will do the most good. And it generates a living set of data that can be updated periodically and therefore will remain usable over many years.
We do have a question from Delegate Corman.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I'm so used to waiting to the end. This actually relates to something you said a couple of minutes ago. Did you say you've already checked 1,400 schools, basically all the public schools?
That's correct. Not all, but very close to all.
Over what period of time were you able to do that?
Approximately 7 months.
How many people were doing that?
We do have some statement of this in the future, but 60 engineers, architects, and about 20 space assessors, folks that measure against the sufficiency standards.
Okay, so about 80 people, so pretty sizable crew.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I mean, I only ask because I remember when IAC couldn't meet its sort of 250 goal in a whole year. So it's impressive. So thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Right. The process had 3 main components. First, BV's team collected data from the LEAs, such as floor plans and equipment info. Then the assessor teams visited each facility to assess the condition and educational sufficiency of the systems and spaces in each facility. And then finally, our BV team worked with the LEAs to validate the collected data.
Thanks, Bill. At our last meeting, we mentioned that the assessment will allow for each facility to have a combined facility score that considers both condition and educational sufficiency. We'll talk more about the educational sufficiency component at your next meeting, but for the next several slides, we'll be discussing just the assessment of physical conditions in the school. A facility's purpose is simply to support the activities that it's intended to house. A facility is made up of many different building systems. Each has an expected lifespan. Expected lifespans vary widely, ranging from 12 to 15 years for carpeting to concrete slabs and foundation walls at about 100 years. Each of the many building systems has a condition score, known as the Facility Condition Index, based on the percentage of its expected lifespan that has been depleted. Knowing the FCI is critical to effectively managing capital maintenance expenditures that are necessary to own and operate a facility in good functional condition. Here you can see the FCI, lower means better relative condition. Higher is less remaining useful lifespan. And I'd like to have Bill now mention some details about how we look at the building systems.
Okay.
Great. Today, because the QC process is still going on, we're limited to looking at FCI data at the statewide level for both facilities and major building systems. In our August meeting, we'll dive deeper and look at FCI data at the school district level. At the last workgroup meeting, we were asked what the major systems we assessed were. There are 16 major systems. In the statewide assessment, our assessors visited every facility, looked at the condition of each separate subsystem in that facility, and estimated the remaining useful lifespan for each subsystem. Those subsystems are rolled up into one of these 16 major standard building systems. Program infrastructure are items that are built-in permanent building systems and equipment that support common school functions. Some examples are casework, cabinetry, commercial kitchen equipment. This category does not include specialty equipment such as computers in a lab, robotic equipment, machine tools in a shop, and other special equipment needed for specialty programs or services that are beyond state required programs and services. It does not include equipment such as internet infrastructure for which there's no statewide standard for which to measure against.
can I interrupt just a minute? We do have a question on chat that says, can you define conveyances, site, and skin?
Okay. I think we may have that, a few examples of those, but conveyances are things that are moving people. So elevators, I don't think there were many escalators, but a walkway or a moving walkway would be a conveyance. Skin would be the facade of the building, so really the outer shell of the building. And sorry, Madam Chair, what was the last one?
Site.
Oh, yeah.
Site.
Yeah, site is the hardscapes. I believe that play fields and ball fields are included in site. Playground fields in site.
And also, before you get started on a roll again, are you looking at ADA accessibility?
We're not looking at ADA accessibility as a code, no.
Okay, thank you.
Tom, could you talk a bit more about the major building systems?
Sure. So each major building system can have multiple subsystems that each have different expected lifespans. You can see that, for example, in flooring. It's on the left in the middle of this slide, where you have carpet, ceramic tile, terrazzo, all with different life cycles, for example. Our calculation for a system, major system FCI, incorporates the cost-weighted lifespans of each of the subsystems. And that's rolled up into 16 FCI ratings for each of the systems. We obtain the overall condition rating for the facility by summing those, or cost weighting all of the major systems according to their weight and their condition in the equation. On the next slide, we're showing the FCIs of each of the relative systems. And these are done without cost weighting. So in other words, it shows the percent depleted of each of the major systems in the building. And depleted value doesn't necessarily denote condition, although there is a correlation to condition. For example, if you were to look at the tread on the tires of your car and they were 50% used up, that doesn't mean that the tires are in bad condition. But if you bought those tires 2 years ago, you can reasonably plan to replace those tires in about 2 more years because they're about halfway through their lifespan. Now, the bars indicate the depleted value for each system without regard to the magnitude of cost. The building level FCI does account for the magnitude of cost for each system. You'll see that on the next slide.
Before you go to that, there was a question about relocatables. County Executive Gardner had a question about how you determined the lifespan as an example of a relocatable. And you're saying that you basically treated relocatables like any other building system. You looked at each of the 16 areas. Does that answer your question, County Executive?
If I may clarify my question, I'd appreciate that.
Fine.
Most of us who have overcrowded schools are trying to get rid of our relocatables in some form or fashion. So I did not think relocatables were going to be considered as part of adequacy for any school. So if we say locatables have a 20-year life or a 30-year useful life, how does that fit into the objective to get rid of relocatables, which we don't really want to consider to be part of a school period?
I can take this question in the way the survey is designed, Madam Chair.
Yes,
Bob
go
Coral,
ahead.
Executive Director. We look at portables as a depletable piece of equipment, like we would an HVAC system, but with a life of 15 years. And we estimate that any system, even if the best of systems, if they get to be twice their expected life, they're way past useful life. We've looked at a relocatable similar to their original purpose, and that was to sufficiently house the students so that education could be supported. It's the only purpose of a facility. When they go past their expected life, the assessment on the pure facility level, which is what we're looking at right now, will look at the remaining life that's expected on that. And that will be on every LEA's evaluations that we are reviewing with them now. Then we will, on the education sufficiency side, we start off looking at them as sufficient educational space as their original intention, but we've designed it so that we can weight that system appropriately if it's deemed by this committee, for instance, to be more important to get rid of locatables than it is to house unhoused students. Those are decisions that we aren't talking about today. We just don't have the information, but that will be picked up by this work group as we go forward.
Madam Chair, I have a question. Casemeyer.
Yes, Senator.
I just wanted to ask Tom or the other gentleman, is this FCI measurement a standard recognized throughout the United States, or is this something that your firm created by itself, or is it a nationally recognized way of measurement?
So it is a recognized standard for measurement. However, the FCI in the industry, Senator, does have a couple different ways of being measured. In this case, we're using a depleted value metric, which is the percent of the life consumed divided by or the percent of life in years consumed divided by the expected useful life. There are other ways in the industry, Senator, to measure it, which would be taking the value of failed systems divided by that same amount, which is a different metric. So to answer your question, yes, it's an industry standard. It's there are a couple different flavors of it, if that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, very good. So this slide shows the total value of each system across the entire portfolio for the state of Maryland schools. So the total height of the bar represents the magnitude of cost of those systems, and that's the maroon. And the pink number is the depleted value, the cost magnitude of the depleted value. And then each of those correlates to an FCI relative to those system groups. You can see that the relative value varies greatly. For example, if you look to the left, structural and electrical distribution have very high costs, whereas systems on the right, like ceilings, flooring, for example, across the portfolio, have relatively low values. And how they weigh into the overall FCI, obviously the costlier systems have greater impact on the overall FCI because they're cost weighted. Some systems with lower FCIs can still affect the delivery of educational programs and services. So a school with a poor HVAC system and good wall finishes will have a high FCI naturally because of the cost of the HVAC system. But a school with a good HVAC system and poor wall finishes will, even if the FCIs are the same, those are basically different impact, particularly in the perception of what people see. They may not recognize that the HVAC system is poor unless they feel cold or hot, but they see the condition of the walls. And so there's a perception issue there. This slide shows the distribution of buildings across FCI bands. So, we took all of the FCI ratings and broke them into 8 different bands in 10% gradients. So you have band 1 through 8. A building in band 1 would be considered to be quite aged and in poor condition. Okay, and that would be on the left side. There are actually 8 of those. Whereas a building in band 8 would be in basically newer condition in the first 10% collectively of its life. About 52% of the school buildings across the portfolio have an FCI of about 50% or higher. So about 52% of the buildings have an FCI 50% or higher. The standard deviation of this data distribution is good at about 14.7. And standard deviation is a measure of quality of the data. And this is what we would call a normal distribution, indicating quality, and there's not, a whole degree of spikiness or erratic data points.
Senator King, did you have a question?
I have a question, but I think I'll wait until later to ask it.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep going then. Thank you,
Okay.
Tom. So what do these bands mean, these percentages of FCI as far as perception goes, which is very important oftentimes. It's a separate issue compared to educational sufficiency, but not always, particularly when we get to higher FCI, and the higher, the worse the conditions. A school, and this is from my experience, and there is nothing that has been published on this that really is relevant to schools. Maybe we'll be able to do that here in Maryland after we all review the data and agree. A school with an FCI below 30% when you walk into it, or an apartment building or a grocery store, feels pretty good. Seems to be working. It feels clean. The air is fresh. The lighting works well. It's functioning as we would expect it to when we walk into the facility. A school with an FCI between 30 and 45% begins to raise questions about, boy, looks like this is beginning to wear out. It could use a little work here and there. You know, it's not as good as we would like for it to be. A school with an FCI between 45 and 60% clearly feels not good. It feels like this needs work. This is being mistreated. It's being neglected. Why is this being ignored? And again, that's the perception from my experience of a parent, teacher, or student perspective walking into an FCI facility like that. And that's a separate view than the actual educational sufficiency. But when we get above 60%, it's hard to separate FCI and educational sufficiency because things are past their expected life. They're way past 50%. They're way past halfway done, and it's hard to keep them operating and working. So lighting is not working properly. There may be a lot of lighting that's too dim. There may be HVAC systems that are not working properly, maybe roofs that are leaking. So whenever we look at those numbers, the alarms begin to go off when we go above 60%. And as we begin to look later on and try to determine how we want to look at educational sufficiency measures, we'll look at that correlation between everything really above 50% and above, and how it correlates to not having an educationally comfortable space that can support the educational programs that are intended to be supported within it. Knowing the FCI of each school within an LEA portfolio and of each major building system is very valuable information for an LEA. And I can tell you that one of your members do this very well. They look at conditions and make really calculated judgments on whether they should keep patching a system or run it out to its expected life so that they can replace and renew the entire school rather than Band-Aid, which is very effective as far as spending goes and for making and helping a school facility get at or more than its expected life. So it helps. Good FCI information will be available very soon, and it will help facility planners and maintenance managers throughout the state to effectively spend limited funding. We have another slide up here, deriving the educational facility score. And what we're talking about is the physical condition. That's the pie on the left side. And we will marry that information with the educational sufficiency measures. And then we will come up with a combined score that we can use to determine what are the highest need school facilities in the state. Highest need meaning those that are least able to support the educational functions in a comfortable, health, and safe learning environment. So it's the FCI is not about educational sufficiency. I just want to say that over again. You can have a bowling alley that can be brand new in excellent physical condition, but it's not a school space. It's not going to work as a school space for teaching English or math or some other educational program or a gym class. So the attributes of what's required in a school are separate than the physical condition attributes. At your next meeting, we'll provide an overview of educational sufficiency component of the assessment, which measures each facility against the educational facilities sufficiency standards that the IAC adopted in 2018. But for now, we're just talking about the preliminary results, and we'll look at that later. We'll loop back to that key topic earlier, and now Alex will talk about total cost of ownership, which is really important.
And before we do, Senator King has a question.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Was it considered there? I know there are different standards across the state for as far as like class size and size of buildings and even the sophistication of a building that is built. Is that kind of thing like say you've got a county that goes by a much lower class size than some of the other areas in the state? Are they penalized for that, or how does that figure into?
Well, we're going to go into that in depth at the next meeting.
Okay.
But I want to say that we worked with all of the LEAs to develop, and then before we adopted the educational sufficiency standards, but they are the absolute minimum spaces that can effectively support educational programs that are not local programs, but those that are required by the Department of Education from pre-K through high school to graduate and get a degree. So that's how the sufficiency standards were formed. How that you use a space, as I know you all are aware, is a local decision. So it doesn't get into that, and I want to talk more about that, but I think it'll be better if we get the groundwork in place and then begin to bite into that more.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
All right,
Alex?
thanks, Bob. We all know that we must be able to afford something to hang on to it, and this includes sustaining our schools and their learning environments. To successfully manage a portfolio of facilities, it's essential to know and manage all the costs of owning those facilities over the lifespans of the assets. Not just those costs associated with acquiring the assets, such as design and construction, but also the costs of planning and of operating and maintaining the facilities. The four phases of the facility's life cycle shown here are planning, design, construction, and operations and maintenance. The expected lifespan of a facility is about 30 years before it needs major renewal, after which it can often last another 20 to 30 years. Design and construction together only require about 3 years on average, but planning takes place on and off, and operations and maintenance are ongoing, of course, over the full 30 years plus. Maintenance is the work required to keep a facility in such condition that it may be fully functional and continuously utilized for its entire expected lifespan. And in this slide, we point out the two major categories of maintenance, which are routine maintenance and capital maintenance. Emergent or unplanned maintenance can get very expensive and can be avoided with proper routine and capital maintenance. Capital maintenance includes replacing components and building systems such as roofs and HVAC systems when they wear out, which can happen one or more times during the lifespan of the facility. Capital maintenance is often overlooked, underfunded, and not adequately planned for, but it's essential to obtaining the full expected lifespan of a facility. Total cost of ownership is contingent primarily on design decisions, such as a facility size and choices of building systems. Subsequently, sustaining the desired conditions over a 30-year period will require spending on operations and maintenance that should be about the same or more than the costs of planning, design, and construction combined, and therefore constitute more than half of the total cost of ownership. This slide shows the major components of total cost of ownership, and we see here that operations and maintenance edge out the other components over the total lifespan. Operations and maintenance, by the way, include the costs of heating, cooling, cleaning, and all maintenance, including capital maintenance, such as the periodic replacement of major building systems. As we noted earlier, over the course of a facility's 50-plus year lifespan, a roof or an HVAC system might be replaced once or twice. HVAC systems, for example, are expensive, amounting on average to about 20% of the cost of constructing the building. So that's no small amount to have to budget for at year 20 or 30. This shows how every decision a facility owner makes during planning, design, and construction can impact the total cost of ownership and ultimately the affordability of the facility. But total cost of ownership doesn't just impact a single facility. For facility owners with a portfolio of facilities like a school district, every project has an impact on the balance of funding needs versus the availability of funds. Affordability must be considered in the early planning of every project. We must understand and compare the total cost of ownership of different options for meeting student demand within a district. In some situations, the total cost of ownership of building one new school could be less than that of renovating 2 existing nearby schools. During design, decisions about what materials to use and which systems to install can significantly affect the long-term cost of ownership. Space, layout, and building system decisions have the potential to either add to or subtract from the total cost of ownership. And following occupancy, good operational practices and timely and appropriate maintenance performed on each system are essential to keeping the total cost of ownership what it should be. We're all acutely aware that public resources are not unlimited. Affordable school facilities require knowing and managing the total cost of ownership. And now I'd like to ask Cassandra to talk some more about total cost of ownership in the IAC's process.
Thanks, Alex. So each project that's completed by the locals impacts their long-term fiscal obligations. During the creation of educational specifications, the LEAs are looking at the needs of each facility, they're considering community input, and they're making critical decisions about the requirements that that facility will need to meet. The ed specs are the educator's instructions to the architect and are used to design the facility within the target scope and budget. So this makes the ed spec submission an ideal time to start the TCO conversation. The IAC requires a TCO estimator at the submission of ed specs. Now, the estimator is a very broad stroke tool that just uses industry spending standards to estimate the total cost of ownership so that everyone understands the fiscal obligation that the facility will impose on the LEA over the course of its lifespan. And I should say that on the locals, on both the LEA and the county, over the course of its lifespan. We don't anticipate when we get that estimator that the costs identified are going to come to fruition exactly as they're laid out. There are still a lot of critical decisions that have to be made at that point, such as which type of HVAC or roof system to install, and those decisions do impact the total cost of ownership. But using the estimator at the ed spec stage begins to educate the communities who are working on the ed specs and keeps the long-term fiscal commitment required to maintain the facility in the forefront of the minds of the individuals that are making those project level decisions. So there has been an idea of statutory incentives for TCO that was first introduced in the 21st Century School Facilities Act of 2018, and that have been discussed by a couple of work groups, the work group on educational development specifications that met in 2018 and 2019, and by this work group on the assessment and funding of school facilities when it first met also in 2019. Some early ideas included the Innovation Incentive Pilot Program that did pass in 2018. It incentivized a lower first cost. It hasn't successfully been used by an LEA, and it doesn't focus on TCO. The work groups subsequently discussed a few other potential incentives, and one of them was included last year in Senate Bill 551 when it was originally drafted, but it was omitted from the final legislation, which revised the Built to Learn Act and extended this work group and your charges. So these conversations we expect are going to continue and should continue because the concept of total cost of ownership creates a powerful lever for potential incentives that can reduce the ownership cost of facilities in a way that financially benefits both the state and the locals, and in fact usually benefits the locals more than the state. Good incentives can allow the LEAs to drive innovation, and it will promote the ability of the LEA to obtain the needed educational environment at a more efficient total cost, which in turn frees up resources that can be applied to other needs in the LEA. Most of the opportunities for incentives that impact total cost of ownership will exist during the design of a project when those important decisions are being made. However, good maintenance can also reduce the total cost of ownership. So Maryland could also employ an incentive that would reward LEAs that exceed the expected lifespans of their building systems, which is data that's being collected by the statewide facilities assessment already. The opportunities for incentivizing total cost of ownership will persist and do merit careful consideration. At a future meeting, we would be happy to spend some time talking more about potential specific incentives in greater detail. And with that, we can all stand for any questions you might have.
Good. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, County Executive Jan Gardner, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I'm raising my real hand. I can't figure out how to raise
That's
my
okay.
hand, so
That works, okay?
I apologize for that.
No, that works.
So I have a couple of questions, and they're probably going to be questions for the next meeting or maybe the meeting after that. But I thought I'd put them out there so that the information could be provided to answer the questions. So I'm going to go back to relocatables for a moment. So relocatables, as I understand it, are being assessed as usable classroom space for the purpose of the physical assessment piece. Now, part of your answer to me, as I understood it to my question I asked earlier, Bob, was, you seem to answer that the educational sufficiency standards would kind of evaluate how relocatables would be valued. But I have the educational sufficiency standards that the IAC adopted, and they don't really they don't say anything about relocatables. So what I'm trying to get to is, how are we treating relocatables for adequacy? How are we trying to address school overcrowding? And again, maybe you can't answer that today, but I thought that when we talk about educational sufficiency standards, you could shine some light on that, because that is an issue of general importance, and I don't really understand how it fits into this.
I can give you a little more information, and yes, we should talk about it a lot more down the road. Recognizing from talking to the LEAs as we were building the RFP, knowing what information we would need in order to resolve questions like this, and you be able to develop a fair outcome that's going to serve everybody. We've looked at portables separately while we measure them as classroom space, because again, they were originally put there as classroom space, and they can work as classroom space, even though they're not desired. We've looked at them separately, so that, in fact, two ways we've looked at them separately. We've looked at the real relocatables that you can pick up and move, and then we've looked at relocatables that are actually built on a permanent foundation, like a classroom. We've looked at them separately so that you can consider them separately as you are deciding how to treat them. By doing this, if you decide you want to take them out and they are not going to be counted as classrooms in determining the highest needs in the state, you can do that. And that will eliminate those spaces and cause a greater classroom deficiency than you would have other than looking at them. Or you could look at them as being a space deficiency, but maybe not as important as another county that doesn't even have relocatables to house students, that have too many students that are coming that can fit into their existing classrooms. And I say that, too many students that are coming, because we recognized in the assessment, just looking at the enrollment today is not wise. It's going to take us 5 years to be able to move any project with good planning to completion. So we looked at, and we didn't use 2020 enrollments, we used the 2019 enrollments prior to COVID. And we took those enrollments and projected them out of what they look like based upon current growth within an LEA, what it would be in the future 5 years, and plug that enrollment into the existing classroom availability. So we're looking at trying to prevent a problem from happening, as well as solve existing problems by having the data to be used like this.
So as a follow-up, Madam Chair, can I ask the follow-up? to
Yes.
that? So if we, when the RLEAs get their facility condition index, their FCIs over the next couple of weeks, will that FCI assume that the relocatables are adequate space or not? Because
Again, we are looking at the bricks and mortar buildings with the 16 systems that Bill and Tom have described. We are looking at a relocatable as a piece of equipment like an HVAC system or a roof that has a start and an end life. We know that relocatables were never intended to be permanent facilities. So we have a 15-year expected life on those. So looking at it FCI wise, they're actually favored for a higher FCI rating than bricks and mortar. So you're going to get a higher FCI score when we include the relocatables than you would without them.
all right,
Delegate
I have a few more questions, but maybe I'll just put them in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say you can put them in the chat, or if you want to email them to Michelle Lambert or Rachel Heiss, and we'll make sure that they get to the appropriate person
All right, I
to
can
get
do
those
that.
answers. Okay, I'd be happy to do that. Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I've been on this group with County Executive Gardner for 3 years, and you've been there the whole time, Bob. And I'm sure you're getting deja vu from the line of questioning as well, and so am I. I mean, we're back to the same thing we were at a couple of years ago, which is if we're not going to look at capacity within the context of the FCI, it's a huge problem for a lot of your stakeholders to then make decisions based on this FCI. And I'm still not clear all this time later how we're going to reconcile with that. And I guess I'm not asking you to answer that now, but I'm just going to keep, just as we did 2 years ago when we had all those meetings in person, that's just going to keep coming up again and again and again. And it's a big deal for a lot of the stakeholders in this room or in this Zoom and tuning in. And I apologize, I didn't hear an adequate answer to the county executive specific questions, but it just brought back in my mind the sort of existential question about how we're doing this. I don't want a roof falling on any child. But we also need to make sure there is a roof over every child. And that's an issue too. And we're just still at the same place we were a couple of years ago, unfortunately.
And Madam Chair, I apologize. I thought we had covered that, and obviously we haven't. So I'm going to use an analogy, and I'll borrow Tom's analogy of the car with tires that are 50% gone. That's what the FCI is measuring, what the sufficiency of the physical condition of that car. You may need that car to carry 12 people, and that's capacity. And that is not part of the FCI. We will look at that on the educational sufficiency portion. And then we marry those, that's right. And we marry those two together to develop the score of educational sufficiency. So let's say you're instead of a car, you're a builder, and same tires on your truck. And but it's not a truck, it's a Honda Civic. And you've got a really brand new Honda Civic, it's got brand new tires on it, but it is of no value to you at all because you're a contractor and you need to put sheets of plywood in the trunk. It would have like on the bowling alley example, it would have a very low FCI. It's in good condition. But on the sufficiency side for its purpose, it's going to have a really poor score because it's not even close. But we're not to that. We have to, we look at that separately, and then we marry those two to get a score later.
Question.
Yes.
So Bob, I'm still being new to this. So when the LEAs get their FCI numbers, whatever time that is, for a certain school, will that number include the relocatables or not?
Yes, it will include the relocatables.
Okay.
And it will identify them as relocatables, and for the purpose that we can use that data independently or joined, either as FCI or as along with the education sufficiency at a later point.
Any other questions? Okay, Michelle, when are we meeting again?
August 25th at 3 p.m. And I sent out a revised work group schedule to everybody last month, but I'll resend it again so that everyone has it.
Okay. And at that work group, we'll be getting more into the area more into the educational sufficiency area. Okay. And in between that time, between now and that time, the local LEAs should have received the data about their schools. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You'll probably be hearing from them as well.
And we're in the quality control process right now.
I bet you are.
Yes,
Yeah.
we are. And, you know, it certainly is it's a more precise, but more consistent way of looking at the data, as BV
Sure.
have explained. But it's very different from looking at repair costs, which is what
Right.
we have done in the past.
I think that's a very important distinction. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you then in a few weeks. After
Thank you.
Mako, as we say. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you, members.
thank you.
Thank you, members.
Thank you.